Thank you very much. Maneru, masvera sei. And don't ask me anything in Shona or on Debele. Still very much on the learning curve. Indeed, thank you very much for having me here tonight, and thank you very much for the interest shown. I'm very happy to see so many journalists, people from media here, and I'm very happy that EU has had this engagement with you, and I'm very keen on following it up. EU is very keen on having a relationship with media. Press freedom is one of the is a priority for us, and we want to remain engaged. So I was very happy to find this forum. So my predecessor Philip van Dam has been here several times, so I understood. You will find that I'm not a man of his stature, at least not in terms of height, for those who know him. But hopefully you, even in the back, can see me. So here we are. Indeed, EU and Zimbabwe, and I got those points that you guys wanted me to refer to, and better to take the bull by the horn and indeed address some of those things that that you probably would be interested of asking about anyway. The one thing that seems to come very prominently in media, or at least parts of the media, when discussed about the EU, is the issue of sanctions. Now, we don't call them sanctions. We have an instrument called restrictive measures, which indeed are a targeted set of measures against a number of individuals, and then they include measures against the company, and then an arms embargo. So what does it mean? As regards individuals, we have active measures at the moment in place only against the former presidential couple, which means a travel ban, a visa ban, a freeze of assets. Then there's a number of 3 other people who are also on that list, but on a suspended basis, which means that we don't have any active measures against them. Then what is included is a ban on cooperation with Zimbabwe Defense Industries, which is an entity that was involved in different kind of dealings, and for example in the diamond business. Then an arms embargo, which means that we can't export armaments and other products as the like here. Now, if you have that list in mind, and then you think when people are claiming that, you know, your sanctions are killing the country, you are hurting the economy, and that's why Zimbabwe can't prosper and rise, you know, I would challenge them to explain, you know, how these very targeted and restrictive measures would have that influence. That list of individuals and entities in that list has been much wider in the past, and it's quite limited at the moment. So as you can hear and see, so frankly, this discussion about the effect of EU measures on Zimbabwe requires further detailing and thinking. I'm not commenting on other measures by other nations. Other issues that you wanted me to refer to, indeed, Cyclone Idai. A devastating, horrible natural disaster to which EU here in Zimbabwe responded on the basis of the cooperation and the modalities that we already had in place here, particularly the Health Development Fund. Let me put that into context. When I came into the country, I was presented by our head of cooperation with a matrix, a list of EU interventions and activities and development programs, and it was an A3 paper, a big one, printed on both sides, and printed in such small print that I could barely read it out myself. I should have brought a copy. I'll bring a copy next time so you can see it for yourselves. And that was all the different EU development projects that we had in this country, and there's quite a number of those, to the tune of approximately 250 million, and even more if you calculate the regional and global programs. And part of that cooperation that we have is to the health sector. Two main other sectors are agriculture and governance. So under this health sector we have a program called the Health Development Fund, and that fund was very quickly then mobilized together with our UN partners to address the situation in the Eastern Highlands, and to first of all the produce of forwarding medicine to the affected areas. Unfortunately, they were stuck in Mutare for quite a while because the access was so difficult. So we mobilized these programs that we had already in place in order to give first emergency relief to the area, together with our other development partners who were funding the programs, and together with UN that were having a coordinated role. Then further on down the line, then we had a new response. 3.5 million euro was given to the regional response to IDAI, so Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and then €500,000 then is directed now to Zimbabwe from those operations. We are looking at ways and means of mobilizing more, because clearly the needs are there. But there's also a bit of an issue, a bit of a chicken and an egg situation also, because we need to know what exactly are those needs, and also then to adjust our response accordingly. And we would need to have a request also by the government or by the UN organizations also that we could respond to. Now, this week we have a mission from the EU Humanitarian Office, ECHO, in Zimbabwe, exactly looking at those things. In fact, I'm joining their mission on Wednesday. I'm going to join the mission, and hopefully we'll make our way also to Chimanimani and look at the situation there. Garitza, you also asked about our press release today. That was very much linked to the relief efforts on as a consequence what happened with the cyclone and our response to that. So part, this funding was then used to mobilize a helicopter that will be there to the use primarily by the World Food Programme, but also our other partners that need access to the area. I don't know if you have heard the most recent news, but my understanding at least is that it has been raining heavily there, and access that was already open and the roads that were open apparently has become again more difficult. So you need to have this air link. You need to have this helicopter, this response. And UN told us that the first most important priority at the moment is access, and that's why that funding was then mobilized to organize for a helicopter on site. So that's now there for the service of getting access to the affected areas. So I think I responded to some of those issues, but I know that the format is more that from you to ask questions, from me then try to answer. And please bear with me, that I indeed October, I can't say that I'm new in the country anymore, I'm afraid, but there's many things for me to learn about Zimbabwe and from Zimbabwe. So I'm trying to use all the opportunities for learning as well. And I might not know everything that you might be asking about, but I will sincerely try my best and try to be as helpful as possible. Would that be okay for our starters? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
First things on my plate when I arrived here and on my agenda when I arrived in Zimbabwe was indeed the elections, our assessment of the elections and the recommendations of the Electoral Observation Mission. We are obliged from the delegation side to follow up on the recommendations of that EU Electoral Observation Mission. mobilizing a mission like that is an expensive exercise, and you shouldn't do that. Just launch it, make it happen, and then forget about it. No, we have an obligation to follow up on that work that the electoral observation mission did, and very much engage in dialogue with government and other stakeholders, because those recommendations also pertain partly to other stakeholders on those recommendations. And there's no way that we can impose those recommendations, obviously not. It's not a thing that you have these recommendations, then you have to take them. But they are there as a hopefully useful, positive contribution from our side, and drafted by very senior, knowledgeable people who have experience from all over the world, from elections and the framework surrounding electoral practices, to the Zimbabwean context. And so our hope has been very much that we present these recommendations, and then they will be taken into account, discussed, and judged on their merits. And of course, it's not the only show in town. We had other electoral missions. We had Zimbabwean CSO churches observing and making their own judgments. And obviously we have then the internal reflection of the public entities, such as the Electoral Commission, which has been going through now their own assessment on lessons learned. So we want to present these recommendations as a useful contribution, and we are obliged to follow them up. So that's what we have been doing recently. We've been engaging with different stakeholders on those recommendations, their views on those, and I'm quite happy about the response so far. First of all, they seem to tally very much with the other observations done from the elections, both from the international observers and from the domestic monitors and observers. So that was the first thing that I judged that was positive for us, because it seemed to be a part of something that others also shared. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is, of course, that we see that in the other recommendations how they fit into the Zimbabwean context, going from now onward, and that's where we want to tap in. And it's, of course, it needs to be a Zimbabwean-owned process. And I'm happy that you have the ZEC has gone through their own reflections. You now have the interministerial task force looking at these things, and we are very, very much interested in engaging and working on that, so that next time around, these issues that were observed, the negative criticism, then could be addressed. I'm sorry, I've been very lengthy on this topic, but we can, if there's further questions on that, we certainly can follow up on that.
Thank you, Ambassador.
With a background of the frame, what is the basis of Zimbabwe-EU relations, and what is where our aid relationship and also our political relationship, what is the foundation for those? And those are, I don't know if people know very well, but it's the Cotonou Agreement between African, Caribbean and Pacific states, and then the EU and its member states. And so we have this Cotonou Agreement, and within that Cotonou Agreement, there's many different clauses, and ranging from economic cooperation. It used to be very important for trade as well, which is, by the way, an important topic that is not necessarily discussed very much in the EU-Zimbabwe context, but which I would very much hope to come back to much more. But it touches on our political relations, the values that we share, the principles, and also then our aid relationship is very much based on this Cotonou Agreement. Now the Cotonou Agreement tells us that we should have a political dialogue between the EU and its member states, and then the particular ACP, African, Caribbean, Pacific states that we have. And this is that dialogue has not always taken place as the Cotonou Treaty would have detailed here in Zimbabwe because of the difficult time that we have had in our relationships. But the principle of dialogue is there, and I see it as a responsibility of a diplomat also to have that dialogue going on. So you have this drive from the government side, talking about re-engagement with us, with other Western countries, with other actors. And then you have this, that what I see almost as an obligation, that you need to dialogue, you need to discuss, you need to convey your messages and try to understand your counterpart. And this was very much the agenda that I came with me in this country, that I've tried to reach out to as many people as possible in the government and outside the government to try to understand and see where they would be coming from. And I've been, since then, met quite a lot of ministers, permanent secretaries, I met the president, and so forth. So this re-engagement drive from the government is something that we want to respond to. We want to keep that dialogue going, we want to discuss. But that means that we also need to discuss about difficult issues. It's not all a dance on roses between EU and Zimbabwe even these days. There's issues that we need to tackle and discuss. But the thing is that you need to discuss about those transparently and in as a constructive manner as possible. And here we come to your questions on the violence that we had first in August and then again in January. And it has to be said that those were setbacks. And in our perception, in terms of respecting human rights and rule of law, and you can't shy away of that. It created repercussions, and also I think they also created an issue about Zimbabwe's reputation also in Europe. When it was very prominently in the news, particularly the January events. These are issues that we need to discuss, indeed, with the government. So they have an influence, and they show to an extent that whilst me personally, and I guess many would have, a hope that we could have engaged in perhaps concentrate our energies on other issues, such as economic cooperation and trade and investment and so, but it shows that these issues about human rights are very much still on the table and need to be addressed and discussed. So, for example, after the January events, I very much reached out to various interlocutors in the government of conveying our concern first of all, trying to convey the message of urgency that this needs to stop. These violations need to stop, and then later on with the message that there can't be impunity for human rights violations. And this is something that we have been, quite frankly, and I've had good discussions with government interlocutors about these issues. And for example, now when we had this UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and then the government basically welcomed the UN to come and look at the human rights violations that occurred in January. I think that's a very positive step, and we are hoping to see that being followed up indeed. On the aid side, reference to the history of our aid, which has gone through different phases, also since 2000s, also very much based on the Cotonou Agreement. And one guiding principle there is that, and which makes the EU a bit of a special partner in terms of our engagements with African, Caribbean, Pacific states, is that we need to agree with the government about how and where we channel our aid. So we can't, from our perspective, we can't just go and start projects here and there and do as we will and do as we want. No, it's a structured process where we discuss with the government and agree with the government of exactly how we channel our aid. And this happens in the beginning of a multi-annual financial period. We have this multi-annual financial period that flows from the general logic of how the EU functions. The whole EU functions, all of its institutions function on a basis that the member states, the European Parliament, the member states in the Council and the Parliament and the Commission come together and agree at a certain point in time of this funding for the next 5 to 7 years for all EU operations, our internal agricultural support, the financing of the institutions, etc. And the same applies for development cooperation, which means that we have a multi-annual financial framework for cooperation as well, and for the ACP countries, including Zimbabwe, it's now running from 2014 to 2020. Under that, when we need to then agree with the government about how we channel our aid, and we have what we call an agreed indicative program, a national indicative program with the government, which is to the tune of approximately 250 million euro. And we agreed with the government that it goes to health, agriculture, and governance. So it's something that has been agreed with the government. So in principle, they should be also happy about how we channel it, because they have also approved, where the funding it is going. So the idea of Zimbabwe not benefiting, of not having an advantage of this aid, is a little bit alien, because it has been agreed first with the government, but also it also includes the elements of what we think is beneficial and important for the Zimbabwean people. And so we have then agreed on these 3 sectors. And I was quite happy to find these 3 main sectors in our cooperation. One, for governance, because I think that's extremely important for reforms. I'm quite happy, for example, that within this, under this topic, we have, for example, programs that enhance access to justice, that support constitutional alignment processes, including the media legislation, by the way. And then I was very happy that health is another primary focus, and even more so with the recent issues that we have had in the health sector. I'm afraid that that situation would have been worse without the Health Development Fund that EU and other partners, including DFID, for example, are supporting. So I was quite happy to have that as a focus area. And then indeed agriculture. Myself, I'm a farmer's son. I think that agriculture is important as such, as a basis for human life, basically, but also because I recognize that what kind of an engine for growth it could be in Zimbabwe, given the right regulatory environment and governance, and I was very happy to have that as one main area here. But within these overall headings, like I said, there's a myriad of interventions, of projects in different areas. So the idea that our aid wouldn't be eroding the sovereignty of Zimbabwe, I can't subscribe to that at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the clarity. I hope the information answered.
The restrictive measures, maybe I should also give a little bit of a background of what kind of an instrument they are. They are a highly legal instrument, and they are drafted and agreed upon on the basis that they would be, could be subject of a legal scrutiny. So that gives a basis of then how those entities and individuals in under a restrictive measures instrument would then be included. Yes, the question about who they are, the three other names. So I remind you that these are not on the active list, but on the suspended list. So there's the head of the armed forces is there, and then we have the current Minister of Agriculture, and then we have Vice President Chiwenga on that list. But on the suspended list, so we don't have an active list. They are not on the active list, so there's currently no active measures on these three persons. So so coming back then again on the nature of and how these kind of instruments work, is that you need to find from open sources enough evidence and reasons to add people on that list. So we are now referring to what has been happening in the past. So people that have been linked to issues about violations of democratic principles and human rights. With time now, then that list has got much shorter, and it has shrunk. So it's much shorter than it used to be. But the main fact is that when you're looking at the list, then and when you're addressing the entities, including the Zimbabwe defense industries, is that you need to then be able to, if these would be challenged, it could be done on an individual basis. And earlier we did have a challenge against from a person who was included in that list, which was then that challenge didn't go through. So everybody who would be a subject in that measure is notified. A letter has been sent, and there's instructions of what one should be do about it if they are on the on that list. So this brings me back to the issue about how they are perceived as a means of collective punishment, because the whole instrument is about individuals, persons and companies. So so that's why I think it erodes the argument away from that these are intended to harm the whole population or a country because of some evil intentions by the EU side. It's it's the indeed these people who are on the have been when they are renewed, they are always notified, and they have they can challenge that decision. So it's very legalistic. It's lawyers are looking at these things, and that's how it works. If they have been efficient, I think that was your question about how if they have been promoting democratic principles in Zimbabwe. I hope so. I really don't have the experience, and then I haven't been into the country for 20 years, so I can't really say how they have been. But I can certainly see that they are an item of discussion. So regardless of their limited scope. So I think if they are if they are promoting democracy from the point of view that they are discussed as an issue, and that reminds that what EU is thinking, that is that we would stick to certain a number of universally agreed, and by the way also universally agreed principles on human rights, but also principles that are enshrined in African Union Charter for Human Rights, for example, or indeed principles that are in the Cotonou Agreement. So at least it works very much as a reminder in that regard. On the issue of media, status of the media in the country today and how it was before. Again, I'm a bit handicapped that even though I was trying to follow Zimbabwe up to a point from my previous job from Lusaka, it was very difficult, because you're mainly concentrating on the country where you're posted. So I don't have the benefit of experience to be able to compare it to an extent. But I could say that what I see is that the Zimbabwean media is very, very divided. What the electoral observation mission also saw that, and one of the point of their criticism was that the publicly owned media was very biased before the elections, and there are a number of recommendations on that, which we also want to follow up on. Bias in favor of the government, and I would say that I recognize that in today's media landscape as well. On the other hand, I'm very happy to see here a very professional, critical, free media that you are also a part of, and you don't have that in all African countries. I've had experience in Africa for some time from different perspectives, and I would say that Zimbabwe has a strength in that you have, despite having this issue about criticism on the publicly owned media side, that you have a very vibrant private media that also brings new aspects to that discussion. So I think that's very, very, very helpful, and I think it's that's also very useful. So you have different angles to different stories and topics, and I use quite a lot of my day, maybe a little bit too much, of going through media, reading newspapers, going through social media, and it's quite vibrant, sometimes aggressive, not always right, not always factual and truthful. Sometimes I wish journalists would do their homework better. But in the main, I'm very happy that I'm in a country where you get different sides of the story and you get different angles. That's not always the case. How it relates, how was it before and how is it today? It's a bit of a difficult question. Right. So the forced disappearances. And indeed, disappearance of Itai Dzamara. We had recently the sad anniversary of his disappearance, which we also marked in the social media, also signaling from our side that we have not forgotten about his disappearance. And unfortunately, we had then similar events now in January about people disappeared, and then. So this is a sad streak in Zimbabwean history that you have these kind of events, and this is part of our dialogue also with the government, that we have been saying that there can't be impunity. You need to follow up on these issues. So this is a constant message that we have in our engagements with government. I hasten to add that the human rights are not the only issue that we discuss about the government. With the government, we discuss about a range of issues, including economic cooperation. But human rights are there, and there's an understanding that we need to tackle these issues also that stem from the August and January events. And the government has also committed themselves that they will be following up on the recommendations of the North Atlantic Commission, which is very pertinent also to the January events. But on the forced disappearances, indeed, we remembered the anniversary of Mr. Dzamara's disappearance, and indeed it's an issue that, with the other violations, we are also bringing to the attention to the government, and our call is that there shouldn't be any impunity, and for God's sake, no repetition of similar kind of events. So it's important. Right. Complaints about higher standards, Zimbabwe than other countries. It's not an easy question. Country situations are different. The histories of countries and their relations, in my case with the EU, are different. Where we are coming from, there are different situations, but I'd say, prior to 20 years ago, Zimbabwe was from, or let's say, Zimbabwe is has a history that merits for itself that it could be judged by high standards. So that's why I think these kind of issues and the violations of the past have been difficult for our relationship, the human rights violations. Again, January, again August, the events in August were a setback because the elections, there was a number of flaws and not everything was perfect, but everything had gone quite peacefully until then, so it was an important setback. Then again, the January events were quite a bit of a shock. The fact that we need to continue addressing these issues and discussing about these issues. I would not say, for example, that addressing and discussing and condemning, the events of last January would be of putting the bar very, very high for Zimbabwe. I think these kind of events would need to be addressed wherever they would occur. Many people, for example, in the social media are coming to me with questions about France and, the Yellow West protest and so forth, and saying that don't we have double standards? Why are we criticizing violations here? But the situation in France is discussed in Europe. It's discussed in the European Parliament. But to criticize and to try to look at the human rights situation in Paris is not part of my job. My part of my job is to look at what is the situation in Zimbabwe. Similarly, I've been saying this in the discussions, for example, in an interview that I had recently, that if African ambassadors in Europe would want to take the same approach and look at human rights issues in Europe, I think it would be a healthy approach. Why not? It's the universal principles that we all adhere to, and the standards should be the same for us. So I think that would be something to be looked into. So it's an issue of not attacking Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe is Zimbabwe, but reminding us that we have these values and that human beings have rights that should be inviolable, and the other alternative is to be not to talk about those, which I think it would be irresponsible. Comparing to other countries, it's a difficult question, but my encouragement would be that, judged by higher standards, so be it. Then please let's help each other to reach high standards, so that Zimbabwe could really take its rightful place that it has in the region and in Africa. And I think the EU is a willing partner, and that's part of our support. Also financial support. That's why we are in constitutional alignment. That's why we are in access to justice. That's why we have been supporting, for example, public financial management, all these issues. We have I'm trying to read my own notes. The ailing economy, and if our aid is in support of that, and that was a question about how we support the government, how we support Zimbabwe and the economy. Sorry? Right. Okay. One of my favorite topics. Like I mentioned, there was everything that we do. Practically everything that we do has been agreed with the government. Like I said, it's the multi-annual financial framework, it's the national indicative program. We have agreed upon those main sectors and focuses with the government when we started our cooperation, and we are in constant contact with the Ministry of Finance, that is our main interlocutor on our programs. Anytime we have a substantial change, I'm obliged to write a letter to Mr. Guamatanga, Permanent Secretary, of asking for their okay or approval for this or that change, major change in our programs. So it's all quite transparent and agreed upon. So so it's done with the government. Not to the full extent. We also have cooperation with the NGO community. Obviously, a lot of our aid goes through CSOs, but even that has been agreed with the government that this is the way we operate. So for the government, we have technical assistance, particularly the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Justice, for example, are benefiting from technical support that we are giving through experts that work in these government entities and with them. And we hope that it's going to a good use. But I think what I think I get from your question is the economic aspect, and if it's supporting the country economically. Here I would refer to our support to agriculture. We have, our investment in agriculture is approximately 80 million euro. That's how much money we have put into agriculture. And the idea with that support, to a very large extent, is to make it competitive, make it private sector led, help it to become an engine, maybe not the only engine, but an engine for growth for Zimbabwe. So we are looking at land policy issues. We are looking at audits, for example, to solve the somewhat messy situation that is on the ground about the ownership situation and how agricultural properties don't function as collaterals at the moment. We are looking at livestock value chains. We are looking at how to help them and the producers to be more competitive on the regional markets and eventually also on the European one. We are looking at food security issues within agriculture. So all these things I hope will have an economic benefit. Plus, and I'm very happy because it lets me make a link to an issue that I would have loved to talk about more extensively even is trade. That's in Zimbabwe is special in a sense that it has a free trade agreement with EU since 2008. Together with Comoros, Madagascar, Mauritius and Seychelles. They are in an interesting grouping called the Eastern and Southern African States grouping. And this trade agreement holds a lot of potential. Zimbabwe has a right to export duty-free, quota-free to the European markets. And what is interesting is that even though Zimbabwe has a huge trade deficit in general, it has a trade surplus with Europe. Zimbabwe enjoys a trade surplus in its trade with the European Union, which is quite remarkable because EU, the single market, is the third biggest economy in the world, and Zimbabwe enjoys a trade surplus. Now the amounts are not mind-boggling because it's the trade between the EU and Zimbabwe is approximately only 5% of Zimbabwe's whole trade. But Zimbabwe enjoyed in 2017 a 256 million euro surplus in its trade. And it's agricultural produce mainly. And I think this is a message for hope for me. So because this could be expanded upon, this could be built upon. And I think more than aid, I think the future really is trade and investment. If we could expand on this, it could, bring these long-awaited export revenues. It could help to boost the economy. Put Zimbabwe on a track of growth, real growth. But there's a need to address these bottlenecks of the whole regulatory and environment around it.
There's been a question by Ish pertaining to your practical intervention in cyclone disaster. It says.
Yes. How it functions normally in these humanitarian operations that you have an appeal. You might have registered that a couple of weeks back we had a UN-led appeal for the food security situation that is expected in Zimbabwe. You know, the expectation, the sad expectation, is that there will be problems with food security because of erratic rain patterns and drought. So basically, this is what happens, and these kind of appeals for humanitarian aid can come from governments, like from Zimbabwe, and then from UN agencies, where they have then put down basically a list and quantified the needs, and then they are asking for donors, well, for supporters, for humanitarian aid givers to come and chip in the situation. I've seen a letter of appeal from Chipinge town. Mozambique, the government has made an appeal, but maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, and I haven't gotten the most recent news, but I'm not aware that the government has yet made this kind of an appeal. And it's not a criticism against the government, because it's, you know, to make this kind of an appeal, then you need to have, you know, a number of solid facts about, you know, exactly what those needs are, and, you know, how much funding you are looking for. So it's not a matter of criticism, but it's just an observation that I'm not aware of such a call to the international community as of yet by the government.
Thank you, Ambassador. Stanley, you had a question. Then after you, this comrade was seated here, and Riga, in that order.
You know, to what needs to be done in order to remove the restrictive measures. In fact, that's the first time I've been asked that question. Normally the message is, you know, remove them, you know, sanctions are illegal, take them away, you know. That's the message that I usually am hearing. So it's quite interesting to have that question. And unfortunately, I can't give you a straightforward answer, because that comes back to the nature of that instrument, which is very legal. It concerns individuals. It concerns business entities, and indeed the arms embargo there. So it's more about a question about, you know, that relates to the details in that decision, and how all of those entities are perceived by the decision makers, obviously based on the observations on the ground. But overall, I would then say that, you know, these kind of events like in January definitely don't help in a situation where you want to move into a different direction. You're talking about the restricted measures, but then it's based on the overall situation, which then influences the legal thinking as well. So it's, for example, if you're thinking, if we address, for example, the issue about the Zimbabwe defense industries, which is one of there's many questions around about that entity and its activities and its topics. What is it doing? And, you know, about its history and involvement in a number of issues, and, you know, what is the status now? And it's quite opaque, and you know, one can't really answer. And then, you know, then it's then that influences also then the thinking of lawyers. The other thing is about the arms embargo. When you had then the events in January, which is basically what I'm referring now when I said about, you know, the January events, you know, it doesn't help, you know, when you're thinking about, you know, relaxing or ending the arms embargo instrument, when you have the security forces using live ammunition and so. But it's also important to note that these restrictive measures can also be reviewed, you know, when the situation allows. So they are something that one can look at, and then, you know, that there's you know, when developments so allow. And this is something that our High Representative Federica Mogherini also mentioned in the press event when these issues were referred to. So it's something that's always possible, and not only as part of the annual exercise when we are looking at the restrictive measures. But I think it's honestly they are blown out of proportion. It's like I realize the interest and the political attention that they are gathering, but I think it's not really the issue in Zimbabwe-EU relations that I would want to see as prominent. And I'm very sad if they are perceived as a huge obstacle, because like I said, there's all these opportunities in trade. There's what we are doing in the cooperation side, and etc. EPAs. Okay. This is a bit of a pet topic for me, because I was working on the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements, when I was in Brussels, working then for the Finnish government, but working very much on this topic. And I think people need to remember where we are coming from and why these EPAs as instruments exist. Now, EU had very special trade relations with these African, Caribbean, Pacific states, many of them former colonies of European member states. And they were built, the whole trade relations were built in the 60s and the 70s, and the idea was to safeguard parts of our special relationships. So there were quotas for sugar, for Mauritius this amount, from Mozambique that amount. There was a guaranteed price, by the way, which was very much linked to our own internal functioning within the EU, because the guaranteed price, for example, for sugar was the same as the European sugar producers were getting. So you had these arrangements which is very convenient, and I do acknowledge it had many developmental aspects, because it had guaranteed quotas and prices for producers from ACP countries, which guaranteed them stability and predictability in their trade. Alas, the problem was that they were not WTO compatible. They were against free trade, competition, so there was a need to dismantle, because there was no justification that was WTO compatible to continue with those trade arrangements. You had countries like Brazil complaining, you had many other, about sugar, for example, which is a topic that I'm a little bit more familiar than others, but there were rice and whatnot, many other produce there as well. So what it meant is that we needed to dismantle the arrangement. And now, roughly then the ACP countries fell into two categories from a trade perspective. Ones that were least developed countries according to a UN definition, for which the WTO granted the exception that for those you could give duty and quota-free access to the European markets. And these countries were then not very interested in negotiating new trade deals with the European Union, because they had the benefit of access to markets regardless. So this is, for example, the situation in your neighbors, Zambia, Mozambique. So there's no drive, no need to negotiate a trade agreement, because you already have that unilateral act from the EU side to provide for those benefits. Then there were countries that were not LDCs, including Zimbabwe, including Kenya, that were then very eager to negotiate EPAs, because otherwise it would have meant that if you would not have had another trade deal, then you would follow on the general preferences, which would have meant that you would have had trade barriers. You would now have tariffs, customs, if you wanted to export something to the EU. Now, this EU never wanted this. There was no interest in having new trade barriers, even for these countries that were not LDCs. So there was this willingness to negotiate new trade deals, and WTO was always giving us new deadlines. Of like, how far can you go with that exemption? And that's why why Zimbabwe was the first country in Africa to sign that trade deal, because Zimbabwe wanted to keep those preferences going. So, and then you had countries such as Mauritius and Seychelles that were in a similar situation, not LDCs, and wanted to keep on that going that trade, and that's why Zimbabwe finds it quite a little bit curiously in this same grouping. I do admit, and I think it was admitted, that there was a imbalance in terms of technical know-how and skills balances and so forth. But if you wanted to be WTO compatible, then there was no choice. You really needed to have new legally binding new arrangements in place. Now the EU has been providing support, both in times of negotiations for ACP countries in order to, to get, to make their offers. For example, if we're talking about trading goods, about what tariffs, what areas of their industry they should support, protect, what could they liberalize, and so forth. But it has been a very, very painful process. And we have been continuing then with that, with support for the implementation of EPAs. We have, for example, 10 million euro to support Zimbabwe in the implementation of the Economic Partnership Agreement. So this is the where we are now at the moment, and what it means also then for the EPAs. If I maybe I've been a little bit long with this topic, but it's quite close to my heart because I think there's opportunities there. Is that then eventually Zimbabwe needs to liberalize more of its trade, also towards the EU, in order to be EU WTO compatible, because I think WTO says substantially all trade need to be liberalized, and I think for Zimbabwe it means that eventually in 2000, is it now 2021? If I remember correctly, Zimbabwe needs to liberalize around 80% of its tariff lines to the EU. At the same time, now we are discussing also about expanding the EPA for services, include services, which I think is important because services are the future of trade. It's not trading goods, it's services. Competition laws, sustainable development goals, all of these topics. And now we are, Zimbabwe with these island states and the EU is looking and scoping what could be the next phase of this EPA agreement. And it's also a topic that I'm quite keen on following up. Right, EPAs, media recommendations, and media reforms, and media as a medium for democracy. This is one of the topics where I've been quite optimistic. It was last November I attended a workshop. MISA was there having a prominent role. The Ministry of Information was hosting the workshop, I think it was. There was all these stakeholders talking together about how to reform the media legislation in order to align it to the Constitution. And now I understood that these principles for the replacing of the IPA, which I think the Minister of Information, I think she referred to IPA, to the word infamous IPA, when in that workshop, which I then briefly went and gave a greeting in. And then I've come up with new draft bills on a number of part of media legislation. We are very keen in the EU delegation to see, the new draft legislation and see, very much interested to see how the constitutional alignment has taken place, and are hoping then that the government will then indeed address the issue of unconstitutionalism of media laws and how they will fix it. The nitty-gritty detail about exactly how this should be done, it's not up to us. It's not us imposing or dictating, but I think it's a very positive move that the Ministry of Information is doing. And I had recently an encounter with the Attorney General, and he really amplified this positive message that there would be the government would be serious about addressing this. So I'm quite optimistic about positive steps taken in that direction in the near future. Opposition and the national dialogue. Now again, this is an area where I wouldn't venture too far of EU dictating what the Zimbabweans should be doing in their national dialogue. I think the fact that the new constitution established the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission is an important signal for Zimbabweans that that these issues from the past, these painful issues, that there's a need to address them, and the Commission has a mandate to do that. I think what the churches are doing in order to try to foster these kind of dialogue processes and discussions is very important. I know that there's the political parties are discussing with each other in different formats within the parliament and outside of the parliament. I think these dialogue issues are very, very important for Zimbabwe in order to get kind of a more, because when especially you saw from the last elections that it's quite a divided country politically, and some of the discussions also in social media is so acrimonious that it really wears you down. So you see that there's a lot of issues that Zimbabweans probably need to discuss about and resolve. So I think these all issues are something that are worthwhile of a good effort and support, and I hope that they will be also successful in targeting and creating a better national consensus about the way forward. I come from Finland, my mother country's native country is a very consensus-seeking society, and I think that helps very much in forging, especially when you have painful decisions to take. So we are very supportive, but again, not prescribing. The EU's role in this dialogue would not be, I see it more of a well-wisher. It's not that we would be there, telling each party of what to do and what to say. No, because for it to be sustainable, for it to be successful, it obviously needs to be a Zimbabwean process.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Colleagues, allow me to take.
I'm sorry for missing that point on the one TV station. I really don't know or what is the reason why Zimbabwe really only has one TV station. Maybe I'm sure in the audience you have people that know better why. I think other African countries also have basically their own only stations that they have, or also in some places you only have one or two public stations. I think for in terms of media freedom and democracy, I think the more channels you have, the better. I understand why the public finances won't be able to cater for more channels, but why not, if private sector would not see that profitable, why not give the opportunity for that? Of course, according to the rules and regulation and honoring a number of principles. All countries have principles guiding how media acts. I would say that my preference, usually what you would think about media ethics, would be self-control rather than imposed control. And I know that there's a number of good examples about how this could work. When media regulates itself, then there's less need for than outside control. I think the emergence of social media has maybe to an extent made this need for have other electronic channels less important, but at the same time, like I said, I don't know what would be a reason of not having more TV channels if an entrepreneur who is ethical and committed and goes by the book and the regulations would be willing to invest in such kind of an endeavor. Of course, there's DSTV, but then many people can't afford DSTV, so you won't get those channels that way. But so I really can't give an exhausting answer to that question. Right. If I go from the back, I roll human rights, other instruments at our disposal, from restrictive measures, which I recognize that there's a lot of interest in discussing about this, but I really would not want to blow them out of proportion and for their meaning. Governance is one of the areas where we are working and giving development cooperation support. We are supporting a number of civil society organizations that are active on the human rights agenda. Again, in full transparency with the government. There's nothing to hide from our point of view. We are supporting different kind of public entities also, including the Ministry of Justice, on these issues, such as access to justice. So promoting human rights is part of our development cooperation agenda as well. So there is that. And plus then we do think that the political dialogue that we are having and discussing about these issues is also a tool of addressing these issues. So I think there's different ways of, and human rights are an issue that need to be supported from different angles and in different ways. Whether somebody has appealed against being on the restricted measures list, I think I've mentioned before that there was an individual whose name unfortunately I can't remember. I'm looking at Thomas. He can't remember that because it was before our time, who indeed made an appeal against that. I've seen the documentation on that issue. He was not successful. Might say that he's not on the list anymore, but there was an appeal had been launched once. Why somebody would not do it now, I really can't answer. That's for the persons involved to judge and do. So I can't answer on their behalf. What would now happen for a person? It's not linked to the ICC. It's not an issue of Slobodan Milosevic or something like that would be sent to The Hague. The restrictive measures are not linked to that kind of activities, or there would be a direct link to the ICC. It's basically, the measures entail that if you would apply for a visa for European countries, you would have difficulties of obtaining that, because you would be on that. It would be checked, and then you would be on that list, and then you would have difficulties of accessing. And then it would be difficult for you also to have assets and a bank account in active use in Europe if you are in EU countries, if you're on that list. So it's this kind of quite specific measures that we are talking about, and that relates really into that individual's own activities. It doesn't, for example, relate to their relatives. It's only the persons who are really mentioned on those lists. But no deportation to the Hague. That's not the mechanism. Corruption and indeed undermining democracy. I very much stand by the comment that I've made on Twitter, and it's something that is basically proven by research that corruption erodes confidence. Confidence is essential to democracy. If you feel that you can't trust another person, be it in the private sector, be it in the public life, because of unfair treatment resulting from corruption, then it erodes the whole fundamentals of the society and how it works. So I think it's quite simple as that. And that's why I think the Transparency Index is so important, because the Transparency International Index on Corruption, the CPI, Corruption Perception Index, that even though it doesn't give, like that you have 56 tons of corruption in this country. It's not a mathematical instrument like that. But it's the perception that is really important, because it's when they ask from people that what do you think is the situation in a given country, and then they respond. It tells about their perception. It tells about their confidence in the level of transparency in that country, which is real. It's not. You can't measure it. You can't put a tape, but it's real because it tells about how people see their own country, and that's what is why the CPI index is very important. That's why I wait for it every year, and that's why I think it's extremely important. So indeed, it has this influence. Now we have heard from His Excellency the President himself that corruption is not tolerated, that it will be tackled, and this is extremely important. And that's it's a very strong and good message to be had, and that's something that one should remember, and one should then observe of how that is translated into action. And this kind of issue about what happens to people who are provenly corrupt, is of course very important. I have to say, coming from a country that has a Roman law and has quite straightforward legal practices, my mind bends sometimes when I'm trying to understand, your legal system and the Commonwealth, based, nothing wrong with the UK and its heritage, but it's still, sometimes very difficult to follow up these legal cases and what happens and where and why even though you had big media headlines, nobody was in the end convicted. And this is an issue that I'm trying to learn about and understand. It's also something that I've been discussing also about with the Ministry of Justice and the Prosecutor General, and trying to understand how that happens, and why is there such a strong perception of corruption, like I hear from many people in Zimbabwe, but why does it seem to result in so few concrete follow-ups, results, and convictions? It's something that I really need to learn and discuss and learn about people about how this happens. But I do think that the messages coming from the top that corruption is not tolerated are important ones, and it's like it holds the hope that in Zimbabwe corruption will be eradicated, and will be hopefully to see concrete steps taken towards that direction during my time here in the country. Aid funding follow-up. Accountability for taxpayers' money is very important for the EU and the European Commission, which is the custodian of most of EU development aid, and that's why we need to have confidence that that money is well used. We were talking about corruption just a moment ago. That's part of the issue, but it's not the whole picture even. Some of those issues also revolve around issues such as good bookkeeping practices in the first place, and reporting, and also results achieved from a given input of funding. Now currently our aid modalities are such that we don't give direct support to government entities, not because we would not want to, but there's when the last multi-annual financial framework was negotiated, then it was agreed that the modalities that would be used would be mainly go through United Nations, go through World Bank, go through NGOs, and then give this technical support also directly to the ministry. But that usually happens in a way that EU pays for an expert, for example, to work, or pays for a process to be taken, and technical assistance, for example, for constitutional alignment. So it doesn't go through government channels. It's not, if you know the principle of budget support, we don't have that at the moment. But regardless of the channel and the way we distribute our funding, we always have quite strict reporting requirements, accountability and monitoring and evaluation. So we have accountants going after, be it an NGO, be it a consultant, be it the UN. We always go, when we need to have those reporting and everything in place. So we are indeed following up on the funding that we are giving. So my name is Timo Olkkonen, I'm the EU head of delegation to Zimbabwe. Oh, we had a very vivid discussion here at the Quilt Club tonight. We're discussing about several issues. We're talking about EU's development cooperation to Zimbabwe. We're talking about our response to Cyclone Idai. We're talking about our political relations. We're talking about the EU restrictive measures around Zimbabwe, our response to the government's willingness to re-engage with Western countries and with the EU. We were talking about trade. We were discussing about trade and the opportunities that the economic partnership agreements potentially have for boosting trade and investments between EU and Zimbabwe. So there was a wide and varied discussion about several different topics here at the Quilt Club tonight.